Section 11 of 3 Essays on Religion. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. 3 Essays on Religion by John Stuart Mill. Argument from the General Consent of Mankind. Before proceeding to the argument from marks of design, which, as it seems to me, must always be the main strength of natural theism, we may dispose briefly of some other arguments which are of little scientific weight, but which have greater influence on the human mind than much better arguments, because they are appeals to authority, and it is by authority that the opinions of the bulk of mankind are principally and not unnaturally governed. The authority invoked is that of mankind generally, and specially of some of its wisest men, particularly such as were in other respects conspicuous examples of breaking loose from received prejudices. Socrates and Plato, Bacon, Locke, and Newton, Descartes and Leibniz are common examples. It may doubtless be good advice to persons who in point of knowledge and cultivation are not entitled to think themselves competent judges of difficult questions, and bid them content themselves with holding that true which mankind generally believe, and so long as they believe it, or that which has been believed by those who pass for the most eminent among the minds of the past. But to a thinker, the argument from other people's opinions has little weight. It is but second-hand evidence, and merely admonishes us to look out for and weigh the reasons on which this conviction of mankind, or of wise men, was founded. Accordingly, those who make any claim to philosophical treatment of the subject employ this general consent chiefly as evidence that there is in the mind of man an intuitive perception, or an instinctive sense of deity. From the generality of the belief, they infer that it is inherent in our constitution, from which they draw the conclusion, a precarious one indeed, but comfortable to the general mode of proceeding of the intuitive philosophy, that the belief must be true. Though as applied to theism, this argument begs the question, since it has itself nothing to rest upon but the belief that the human mind was made by a God, who would not deceive his creatures. But indeed, what ground does the general prevalence of the belief in deity afford us for inferring that this belief is native to the human mind and independent of evidence? Is it then so very devoid of evidence, even apparent? Has it so little semblance of foundation in fact, that it can only be accounted for by the supposition of its being innate? We should not expect to find theists believing that the appearances in nature of a contriving intelligence are not only insufficient, but are not even plausible, and cannot be supposed to have carried conviction either to the general or to the wiser mind. If there are external evidences of theism, even if not perfectly conclusive, why need we suppose that the belief of its truth was the result of anything else? The superior mind to whom an appeal is made, from Socrates downwards, when they professed to give the grounds of their opinion, did not say that they found the belief in themselves without knowing from whence it came, but ascribed it, if not to revelation, either to some metaphysical argument, or to those very external evidences which are the basis of the argument from design. If it be said that the belief in deity is universal among barbarous tribes, and among the ignorant portion of civilized populations, who cannot be supposed to have been impressed by the marvelous adaptations of nature, most of which are unknown to them, I answer, that the ignorant in civilized countries take their opinions from the educated, and that in the case of savages, if the evidence is insufficient, so is the belief. The religious belief of savages is not belief in the God of natural theology, but a mere modification of the crude generalization which ascribes life, consciousness, and will to all natural powers of which they cannot perceive the source or control the operation. And the divinities believed in are as numerous as those powers. Each river, fountain, or tree has a divinity of its own. To see in this blunder of primitive ignorance the hand of a supreme being implanting in his creatures an instinctive knowledge of his existence is a poor compliment to the deity. The religion of savages is fetishism of the grossest kind, ascribing animation and will to individual objects, and seeking to propitiate them by prayer and sacrifice. That this should be the case is the less surprising when we remember that there is not a definite boundary line, broadly separating the conscious human being from inanimate objects. Between these and man, there is an intermediate class of objects, sometimes much more powerful than man, which do possess life and will, viz., the brute animals, which, in an early stage of existence, play a very great part in human life, making it the less surprising that the line should not at first be quite distinguishable between the animate and the inanimate part of nature. As observation advances, it is perceived that the majority of outward objects have all their important qualities in common with entire classes or groups of objects which comport themselves exactly alike in the same circumstances. And in these cases, the worship of visible objects is exchanged for that of an invisible being, supposed to preside over the whole class. This step in generalization is slowly made, with hesitation and even terror, as we still see in the case of ignorant populations with what difficulty experience disabuses them of belief in the supernatural powers and terrible resentment of a particular idol. Chiefly by these terrors the religious impressions of barbarians are kept alive, with only slight modifications, until the theism of cultivated minds is ready to take their place. And the theism of cultivated minds, if we take their own word for it, is always a conclusion either from arguments called rational, or from the appearances in nature. It is needless here to dwell upon the difficulty of the hypothesis of a natural belief not common to all human beings, an instinct not universal. It is conceivable, doubtless, that some men might be born without a particular natural faculty, as some are born without a particular sense. But when this is the case, we ought to be much more particular as to the proof that it really is a natural faculty. If it were not a matter of observation, but of speculation that men can see, if they had no apparent organ of sight, and no perceptions or knowledge but such as they might conceivably have acquired by some circuitous process through their other senses, the fact that men exist who do not even suppose themselves to see, would be a considerable argument against the theory of a visual sense. But it would carry us too far to press, for the purposes of this discussion, an argument which applies so largely to the whole of the intuitional philosophy. The strongest intuitionist will not maintain that a belief should be held for instinctive when evidence, real or apparent, sufficient to engender it, is universally admitted to exist. To the force of the evidence must be, in this case, added all the emotional or moral causes which incline men to the belief, the satisfaction which it gives to the obstinate questionings with which men torment themselves respecting the past, the hopes which it opens for the future, the fears also, since fear as well as hope predisposes to belief, and to these, in the case of the more active spirits, must always have been added a perception of the power which belief in the supernatural affords for governing mankind, either for their own good or for the selfish purposes of the governors. The general consent of mankind does not, therefore, afford ground for admitting, even as an hypothesis, the origin in an inherent law of the human mind, of a fact otherwise so more than sufficiently, so amply accounted for. The argument from consciousness. There have been numerous arguments, indeed almost every religious metaphysician has one of his own, to prove the existence and attributes of God from what are called truths of reason, supposed to be independent of experience. Descartes, who is the real founder of the intuitional metaphysics, draws the conclusion immediately from the first premise of his philosophy, the celebrated assumption that whatever he could very clearly and distinctly apprehend must be true. The idea of a God, perfect in power, wisdom, and goodness, is a clear and distinct idea, and must therefore, on this principle, correspond to a real object. This bold generalization, however, that a conception of the human mind proves its own objective reality, Descartes is obliged to limit by the qualification, quote, if the idea includes existence. Close quote. Now, the idea of God implying the union of all perfections, and existence being a perfection, the idea of God proves his existence. This very simple argument, which denies to man one of his most familiar and most precious attributes, that of idealizing, as it is called, of constructing from the materials of experience a conception more perfect than experience itself affords, is not likely to satisfy anyone in the present day. More elaborate, though scarcely more successful efforts have been made by many of Descartes' successors, to derive knowledge of the deity from an inward light, to make it a truth not dependent on external evidence, a fact of direct perception, or, as they are accustomed to call it, of consciousness. The philosophical world is familiar with the attempt of Cousin to make out that whenever we perceive a particular object, we perceive along with it, or are conscious of, God, and also with the celebrated refutation of this doctrine by Sir William Hamilton. It would be a waste of time to examine any of these theories in detail. While each has its own particular logical fallacies, they labor under the common infirmity that one man cannot, by proclaiming with ever so much confidence that he perceives an object, convince other people that they see it too. If, indeed, he laid claim to a divine faculty of vision vouchsafed to him alone, and not making him cognizant of things which men not thus assisted have not the capacity to see, the case might be different. Men have been able to get such claims admitted, and other people can only require of them to show their credentials. But when no claim is set up to any peculiar gift, but we are told that all of us are as capable as the prophet of seeing what he sees, feeling what he feels, nay, that we actually do so, and when the utmost effort of which we are capable fails to make us aware of what we are told we perceive, this supposed universal faculty of intuition is but the dark lantern of the Spirit, which none see but those who bear it. And the bearers may fairly be asked to consider whether it is not more likely that they are mistaken as to the origin of an impression in their minds, than that others are ignorant of the very existence of an impression in theirs. The inconclusiveness, in a speculative point of view, of all arguments from a subjective notion of deity to its objective reality, was well seen by Kant, the most discriminating of the a priori metaphysicians, who always kept the two questions, the origin and composition of our ideas, and the reality of the corresponding objects, perfectly distinct. According to Kant, the idea of the deity is native to the mind, in the sense that it is constructed by the mind's own laws and not derived from without. But his idea of speculative reason cannot be shown by any logical process or perceived by direct apprehension to have a corresponding reality outside the human mind. To Kant, God is neither an object of direct consciousness nor a conclusion of reasoning, but a necessary assumption, necessary not by a logical but a practical necessity imposed by the reality of the moral law. Duty is a fact of consciousness. Thou shalt is a command issuing from the recesses of our being, and not to be accounted for by any impressions derived from experience. And this command requires a commander, though it is not perfectly clear whether Kant's meaning is that conviction of a law includes conviction of a lawgiver, or only that a being of whose will the law is an expression is eminently desirable. If the former is intended, the argument is founded on a double meaning of the word law. A rule, to which we feel it a duty to conform, has in common with laws commonly so called, the fact of claiming our obedience. But it does not follow that the rule must originate, like the laws of the land, in the will of a legislator or legislators external to the mind. We may even say that a feeling of obligation which is merely the result of a command is not what is meant by moral obligation, which, on the contrary, supposes something that the internal conscience bears witness to as binding in its own nature, and which God, in superadding his command, conforms to and perhaps declares, but does not create. Conceding, then, for the sake of the argument, that the moral sentiment is as purely of the mind's own growth, the obligation of duty as entirely independent of experience and acquired impressions, as Kant or any other metaphysician ever contended, it may yet be maintained that this feeling of obligation rather excludes than compels the belief in a divine legislator merely as the source of the obligation, and, as a matter of fact, the obligation of duty is both theoretically acknowledged and practically felt in the fullest manner by many who have no positive belief in God, though seldom, probably, without habitual and familiar reference to him as an ideal conception. But if the existence of God as a wise and just lawgiver is not a necessary part of the feelings of morality, it may still be maintained that those feelings make his existence eminently desirable. No doubt they do, and that is the great reason why we find that good men and women cling to the belief, and are pained by its being questioned. But surely it is not legitimate to assume that in the order of the universe whatever is desirable is true. Optimism, even when a God is already believed in, is a thorny doctrine to maintain, and had to be taken by Leibniz in the limited sense, that the universe being made by a good being is the best universe possible, not the best absolutely, that the divine power, in short, was not equal to making it more free from imperfections than it is. But optimism, prior to belief in a God, and as the ground of that belief, seems one of the oldest of all speculative delusions. Nothing, however, I believe, contributes more to keep up the belief in the general mind of humanity than this feeling of its desirableness, which, when clothed, as it very often is, in the forms of an argument, is a naive expression of the tendency of the human mind to believe what is agreeable to it. Positive value, the argument of course has none. Without dwelling further on these or on any other of the a priori arguments for theism, we will no longer delay passing to the far more important argument of the appearances of contrivance in nature. End of section 11. Section 12 of 3 Essays on Religion. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. 3 Essays on Religion by John Stuart Mill. The Argument from Marks of Design in Nature. We now at last reach an argument of a really scientific character, which does not shrink from scientific tests, but claims to be judged by the established canons of induction. The design argument is wholly grounded on experience. Certain qualities, it is alleged, are found to be characteristic of such things as are made by an intelligent mind for a purpose. The order of nature, or some considerable parts of it, exhibit these qualities in a remarkable degree. We are entitled, from this great similarity in the effects, to infer similarity in the cause, and to believe that things which it is beyond the power of man to make, but which resemble the works of man in all but power, must have been made by intelligence, armed with a power greater than human. I have stated this argument in its fullest strength, as it is stated by the most thoroughgoing assertors. A very little consideration, however, suffices to show that, though it has some force, its force is very generally overrated. Paley's illustration of a watch puts the case much too strongly. If I found a watch on an apparently desolate island, I should indeed infer that it had been left there by a human being, but the inference would not be from marks of design, but because I already know by direct experience that watches are made by men. I should draw the inference no less confidently from a footprint, or from any relic, however insignificant, which experience has taught me to attribute to man. As geologists infer the past existence of animals from coprolites, though no one sees marks of design in a coprolite. The evidence of design in creation can never reach the height of direct induction. It amounts only to the inferior kind of inductive evidence called analogy. Analogy agrees with induction in this, that they both argue that a thing known to resemble another in certain circumstances, call those circumstances A and B, will resemble it in another circumstance, call it C. But the difference is that in induction, A and B are known, by a previous comparison of many instances, to be the very circumstance on which C depends, or with which it is in some way connected. When this has not been ascertained, the argument amounts only to this, that since it is not known with which of the circumstances existing in the known case C is connected, they may as well be A and B as any others, and therefore there is a greater probability of C in cases where we know that A and B exist, than in cases of which we know nothing at all. This argument is of a weight very difficult to estimate at all, and impossible to estimate precisely. It may be very strong when the known points of agreement, A and B, etc., are numerous, and the known points of difference few, or very weak when the reverse is the case. But it can never be equal in validity to a real induction. The resemblances between some of the arrangements in nature and some of those made by man are considerable, and even as mere resemblances afford a certain presumption of similarity of cause. But how great that presumption is, it is hard to say. All that can be said with certainty is that these likenesses make creation by intelligence considerably more probable than if the likenesses had been less, or than if there had been no likenesses at all. This mode, however, of stating the case does not do full justice to the evidence of theism. The design argument is not drawn from mere resemblances in nature to the works of human intelligence, but from the special character of those resemblances. The circumstances in which it is alleged that the world resembles the works of man are not circumstances taken at random, but are particular instances of a circumstance which experience shows to have a real connection with an intelligent origin, the fact of conspiring to an end. The argument, therefore, is not one of mere analogy. As mere analogy, it has its weight, but it is more than analogy. It surpasses analogy exactly as induction surpasses it. It is an inductive argument. This, I think, is undeniable, and it remains to test the argument by the logical principles applicable to induction. For this purpose, it will be convenient to handle, not the argument as a whole, but some one of the most impressive cases of it, such as the structure of the eye or of the ear. It is maintained that the structure of the eye proves a designing mind. To what class of inductive arguments does this belong, and what is its degree of force? The species of inductive arguments are 4 in number, corresponding to the 4 inductive methods, the methods of agreement, of difference, of residues, and of concomitant variations. The argument under consideration falls within the first of these divisions, the method of agreement. This is, for reasons known to inductive logicians, the weakest of the 4, but the particular argument is a strong one of the kind. It may be logically analyzed as follows. The parts of which the eye is composed, and the collocations which constitute the arrangement of those parts, resemble one another in this very remarkable property, that they all conduce to enabling the animal to see. These things being as they are, the animal sees. If any one of them were different from what it is, the animal, for the most part, would either not see, or would not see equally well. And this is the only marked resemblance that we can trace among the different parts of this structure, beyond the general likeness of composition and organization which exists among all other parts of the animal. Now, the particular combination of organic elements, called an eye, had, in every instance, a beginning in time, and must therefore have been brought together by a cause or causes. The number of instances is immeasurably greater than is, by the principles of inductive logic, required for the inclusion of a random concurrence of independent causes, or, speaking technically, for the elimination of chance. We are therefore warranted by the canons of induction in concluding that what brought all these elements together was some cause common to them all, and inasmuch as the elements agree in the single circumstance of conspiring to produce sight, there must be some connection by way of causation between the cause which brought those elements together and the fact of sight. This I conceive to be a legitimate inductive inference, and the sum and substance of what induction can do for theism. The natural sequel of the argument would be this. Sight, being a fact not precedent, but subsequent to the putting together of the organic structure of the eye, can only be connected with the production of that structure in the character of a final, not an efficient cause. That is, it is not sight itself, but an antecedent idea of it, that must be the efficient cause. But this at once marks the origin as proceeding from an intelligent will. I regret to say, however, that this latter half of the argument is not so inexpugnable as the former half. creative forethought is not absolutely the only link by which the origin of the wonderful mechanism of the eye may be connected with the fact of sight. There is another connecting link on which attention has been greatly fixed by recent speculations, and the reality of which cannot be called in question, though its adequacy to account for such truly admirable combinations as some of those in nature is still and will probably long remain problematical. This is the principle of the survival of the fittest. This principle does not pretend to account for the commencement of sensation or of animal or vegetable life, but assuming the existence of some one or more very low forms of organic life, in which there are no complex adaptations nor any marked appearances of contrivance, and supposing, as experience warrants us in doing, that many small variations from those simple types would be thrown out in all directions, which would be transmittable by inheritance, and of which some would be advantageous to the creature in its struggle for existence, and others disadvantageous, the forms which are advantageous would always tend to survive, and those which are disadvantageous to perish. And thus there would be a constant, though slow, general improvement of the type as it branched out into many different varieties, adapting it to different media and modes of existence, until it might possibly, in countless ages, attain to the most advanced examples which now exist. It must be acknowledged that there is something very startling and prima facie improbable in this hypothetical history of nature. It would require us, for example, to suppose that the primeval animal of whatever nature it may have been could not see, and had at most such slight preparation for seeing as might be constituted by some chemical action of light upon its cellular structure. One of the accidental variations which are liable to take place in all organic beings would at some time or other produce a variety that could see, in some imperfect manner, and this peculiarity being transmitted by inheritance, while other variations continued to take place in other directions, a number of races would be produced, who, by the power of even imperfect sight, would have a great advantage over all other creatures which could not see, and would in time extirpate them from all places, except perhaps a very few peculiar situations underground. Fresh variations supervening would give rise to races with better and better seeing powers, until we might at last reach as extraordinary a combination of structures and functions as are seen in the eye of man, and of the more important animals. Of this theory, when pushed to this extreme point, all that can now be said is that it is not so absurd as it looks, and that the analogies which have been discovered in experience, favorable to its possibility, far exceed what anyone could have supposed beforehand. Whether it will ever be possible to say more than this is at present uncertain. The theory, if admitted, would be in no way whatever inconsistent with creation, but it must be acknowledged that it would greatly attenuate the evidence for it. Leaving this remarkable speculation to whatever fate the progress of discovery may have in store for it, I think it must be allowed that, in the present state of our knowledge, the adaptations in nature afford a large balance of probability in favor of creation by intelligence. It is equally certain that this is no more than a probability, and that the various other arguments of natural theology which we have considered add nothing to its force. Whatever ground there is, revelation apart, to believe in an author of nature, is derived from the appearances in the universe. Their mere resemblance to the works of man, or to what man could do if he had the same power over the materials of organized bodies which he has over the materials of a watch, is of some value as an argument of analogy. But the argument is greatly strengthened by the properly inductive considerations which establish that there is some connection, through causation, between the origin of the arrangements of nature and the ends they fulfill, an argument which is in many cases slight, but in others, and chiefly in the nice and intricate combinations of vegetable and animal life, is of considerable strength. End of section 12.
Section 13 of 3 Essays on Religion. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. 3 Essays on Religion by John Stuart Mill. Theism, Section 5. Part 2. Attributes. The question of the existence of a deity, in its purely scientific aspect, standing as is shown in the first part, it is next to be considered, given the indications of a deity, what sort of deity do they point to? What attributes are we warranted, by the evidence which nature affords of a created mind, in assigning to that mind? It needs no showing that the power, if not the intelligence, must be so far superior to that of man as to surpass all human estimate. But from this to omnipotence and omniscience there is a wide interval, and the distinction is of immense practical importance. It is not too much to say that every indication of design in the cosmos is so much evidence against the omnipotence of the designer. For what is meant by design? Contrivance, the adaptation of means to an end. But the necessity for contrivance, the need of employing means, is a consequence of the limitation of power. Who would have recourse to means if to attain his end his mere word was sufficient? The very idea of means implies that the means have an efficacy which the direct action of the being who employs them has not. Otherwise they are not means, but an encumbrance. A man does not use machinery to move his arms. If he did, it could only be when paralysis had deprived him of the power of moving them by volition. But if the employment of contrivance is in itself a sign of limited power, how much more so is the careful and skilful choice of contrivances? Can any wisdom be shown in the selection of means, when the means have no efficacy but what is given to them by the will of him who employs them, and when his will could have bestowed the same efficacy on any other means? Wisdom and contrivance are shown in overcoming difficulties, and there is no room for them in a being for whom no difficulties exist. The evidences, therefore, of natural theology distinctly imply that the author of the cosmos worked under limitations, that he was obliged to adapt himself to conditions independent of his will, and to attain his ends by such arrangements as those conditions admitted of. And this hypothesis agrees with what we have seen to be the tendency of the evidence in another respect. We found that the appearances in nature point indeed to an origin of the cosmos, or order in nature, and indicate that origin to be design, but do not point to any commencement, still less creation, of the two great elements of the universe, the passive element and the active element, matter and force. There is in nature no reason whatever to suppose that either matter or force, or any of their properties, were made by the being who is the author of the collocations by which the world is adapted to what we consider as its purposes, or that he has power to alter any of those properties. It is only when we consent to entertain this negative supposition that there arises a need for wisdom and contrivance in the order of the universe. The deity had on this hypothesis to work out his ends by combining materials of a given nature and properties. Out of these materials he had to construct a world in which his designs should be carried into effect through given properties of matter and force, working together and fitting into one another. This did require skill and contrivance, and the means by which it is effected are often such as justly excite our wonder and admiration. But exactly because it requires wisdom, it implies limitation of power, or rather the two phrases express different sides of the same fact. If it be said that an omnipotent creator, though under no necessity of employing contrivances such as man must use, thought fit to do so in order to leave traces by which man might recognize his creative hand, the answer is that this equally supposes a limit to his omnipotence. For if it was his will that men should know that they themselves and the world are his work, he, being omnipotent, had only to will that they should be aware of it. Ingenious men have sought for reasons why God might choose to leave his existence so far a matter of doubt that men should not be under any absolute necessity of knowing it, as they are of knowing that 3 and 2 make 5. These imagined reasons are very unfortunate specimens of casuistry, but even did we admit their validity, they are of no avail on the supposition of omnipotence, since if it did not please God to implant in man a complete conviction of his existence, nothing hindered him from making the conviction fall short of completeness by any margin he chose to leave. It is usual to dispose of arguments of this description by the easy answer, that we do not know what reasons the Omniscient may have had for leaving undone things which he had the power to do. It is not perceived that this plea itself implies a limit to omnipotence. When a thing is obviously good, and obviously in accordance with what all the evidences of creation imply to have been the Creator's design, and we say we do not know what good reason he may have had for not doing it, we mean that we do not know to what other still better object, to what object still more completely in line of his purposes, he may have seen fit to postpone it. But the necessity of postponing one thing to another belongs only to limited power. Omnipotence could have made the objects compatible. Omnipotence does not need to weigh one consideration against another. If the Creator, like a human ruler, had to adapt himself to a set of conditions which he did not make, it is as unphilosophical as presumptuous in us to call him to account for any imperfections in his work, to complain that he left anything in it contrary to what, if the indications of design prove anything, he must have intended. He must at least know more than we know, and we cannot judge what greater good would have had to be sacrificed, or what greater evil incurred, if he had decided to remove this particular blot. Not so, if he be an omnipotent. If he be that, he must himself have willed that the two desirable objects should be incompatible. He must himself have willed that the obstacle to his supposed design should be insuperable. It cannot therefore be his design. It will not do to say that it was, but that he had other designs which interfered with it. For no one purpose imposes necessary limitations on another in the case of a being not restricted by conditions of possibility. Omnipotence, therefore, cannot be predicated of the Creator on grounds of natural theology. The fundamental principles of natural religion, as deduced from the facts of the universe, negative his omnipotence. They do not, in the same manner, exclude omniscience. If we suppose limitation of power, there is nothing to contradict the supposition of perfect knowledge and absolute wisdom, but neither is there anything to prove it. The knowledge of the powers and properties of things necessary for planning and executing the arrangements of the cosmos is no doubt as much in excess of human knowledge as the power implied in creation is in excess of human power, and the skill, the subtlety of contrivance, the ingenuity, as it would be called in the case of a human work, is often marvellous. But nothing obliges us to suppose that either the knowledge or the skill is infinite. We are not even compelled to suppose that the contrivances were always the best possible. If we venture to judge them as we judge the works of human artificers, we find abundant defects. The human body, for example, is one of the most striking instances of artful and ingenious contrivances which nature offers. But we may well ask whether so complicated a machine could not have been made to last longer, and not to get so easily and frequently out of order. We may ask why the human race should have been so constituted as to grovel in wretchedness and degradation for countless ages before a small portion of it was enabled to lift itself into the very imperfect state of intelligence, goodness, and happiness which we enjoy. The divine power may not have been equal to doing more. The obstacles to a better arrangement of things may have been insuperable. But it is also possible that they were not. The skill of the demiurgus was sufficient to produce what we see, but we cannot tell that this skill reached the extreme limit of perfection compatible with the material it employed and the forces it had to work with. I know not how we can even satisfy ourselves on grounds of natural theology that the Creator foresees all the future, that he foreknows all the effects that will issue from his own contrivances, There may be great wisdom without the power of foreseeing and calculating everything. And human workmanship teaches us the possibility that the workman's knowledge of the properties of the things he works on may enable him to make arrangements admirably fitted to produce a given result, while he may have very little power foreseeing the agencies of another kind which may modify or counteract the operation of the machinery he has made. Perhaps a knowledge of the laws of nature on which organic life depends, not much more perfect than the knowledge which man even now possesses of some other natural laws, would enable man, if he had the same power over the materials and the forces concerned as he has over some of those of inanimate nature, to create organized beings not less wonderful nor less adapted to their conditions of existence than those in nature. Assuming then that while we confine ourselves to natural religion, we must rest content with a Creator less than almighty, the question presents itself, of what nature is the limitation of his power? Does the obstacle at which the power of the Creator stops, which says to it, "Thus far shalt thou go and no further," lie in the power of other intelligent beings, or in the insufficiency and refractoriness of the materials of the universe? Or must we resign ourselves to admitting the hypothesis that the author of the cosmos, though wise and knowing, was not all wise and all knowing, and may not always have done the best that was possible under the conditions of the problem? The first of these suppositions has until a very recent period been, and in many quarters still is, the prevalent theory even of Christianity. Though attributing, and in a certain sense sincerely, omnipotence to the Creator, the received religion represents him as, for some inscrutable reason, tolerating the perpetual counteraction of his purposes by the will of another being of opposite character, and of great though inferior power, the devil. The only difference on this matter between popular Christianity and the religion of Ormuzd and Ahriman is that the former pays its good Creator the bad compliment of having been the maker of the devil, and of being at all times able to crush and annihilate him and his evil deeds and counsels, which nevertheless he does not do. But as I have already remarked, all forms of polytheism, and this among the rest, are with difficulty reconcilable with a universe governed by general laws. Obedience to law is the note of a settled government, and not of a conflict always going on. When powers are at war with one another for the rule of the world, the boundary between them is not fixed but constantly fluctuating. This may seem to be the case on our planet as between the powers of good and evil when we look only at the results. But when we consider the inner springs, we find that both the good and the evil take place in the common course of nature, by virtue of the same general laws originally impressed. The same machinery turning out now good, now evil things, and oftener still the two combined. The division of power is only apparently variable, but really so regular, that speaking of human potentates, we should declare without hesitation that the share of each must have been fixed by previous consent. Upon that supposition indeed, the result of the combination of antagonist forces might be much the same as on that of a single character with divided purposes. But when we come to consider not what hypothesis may be conceived and possibly reconciled with known facts, but what supposition is pointed to by the evidences of natural religion, the case is different. The indications of design point strongly in one direction, the preservation of the creatures in whose structure the indications are found. Along with the preserving agencies, there are destroying agencies, which we might be tempted to ascribe to the will of a different Creator. But there are rarely appearances of the recondite contrivance of means of destruction, except when the destruction of one creature is the means of preservation to others. Nor can it be supposed that the preserving agencies are wielded by one being, the destroying agencies by another. The destroying agencies are a necessary part of the preserving agencies. The chemical compositions by which life is carried on could not take place without a parallel series of decompositions. The great agent of decay in both organic and inorganic substances is oxidation, and it is only by oxidation that life is continued for even the length of a minute. The imperfections in the attainment of the purposes which the appearances indicate have not the air of having been designed. They are like the unintended results of accidents insufficiently guarded against, or of a little excess or deficiency in the quantity of some of the agencies by which the good purpose is carried on, or else they are consequences of the wearing out of a machinery not made to last forever. They point either to shortcomings in the workmanship as regards its intended purpose, or to external forces not under the control of the workman, but which forces bear no mark of being wielded and aimed by any other and rival intelligence. We may conclude, then, that there is no ground in natural theology for attributing intelligence or personality to the obstacles which partially thwart what seem the purposes of the Creator. The limitation of his power more probably results either from the qualities of the material, the substances and forces of which the nature is composed, not admitting of any arrangements by which his purposes could be more completely fulfilled, or else the purposes might have been more fully attained, but the Creator did not know how to do it. Creative skill, wonderful as it is, was not sufficiently perfect to accomplish his purposes more thoroughly. We now pass to the moral attributes of the Deity, so far as indicated in the creation, or, stating the problem in the broadest manner, to the question what indications nature gives of the purposes of its author. This question bears a very different aspect to us from what it bears to those teachers of natural theology who are encumbered with the necessity of admitting the omnipotence of the Creator. We have not to attempt the impossible problem of reconciling infinite benevolence and justice with infinite power in the Creator of such a world as this. The attempt to do so not only involves absolute contradiction in an intellectual point of view, but exhibits to excess the revolting spectacle of a Jesuitical defence of moral enormities. On this topic I need not add to the illustrations given in this portion of the subject to my essay on nature. At the stage which our argument has reached there is none of this moral perplexity. Grant that creative power was limited by conditions the nature and extent of which are wholly unknown to us, and the goodness and justice of the Creator may be all that the most pious believe, and all in the work that conflicts with those moral attributes may be the fault of the conditions which left to the Creator only a choice of evils. It is, however, one question whether any given conclusion is consistent with known facts, and another whether there is evidence to prove it. And if we have no means for judging of the design but from the work actually produced, it is a somewhat hazardous speculation to suppose that the work designed was of a different quality from the result realized. Still, though the ground is unsafe, we may, with due caution, journey a certain distance on it. Some parts of the order of nature give much more indication of contrivance than others. Many, it is not too much to say, give no sign of it at all. The signs of contrivance are most conspicuous in the structure and processes of vegetable and animal life. But for these, it is probable that the appearances in nature would never have seemed to the thinking part of mankind to afford any proofs of a God. But when a God had been inferred from the organization of living beings, other parts of nature, such as the structure of the solar system, seemed to afford evidences more or less strong in confirmation of the belief. Granting then a design in nature, we can best hope to be enlightened as to what that design was by examining it in the parts of nature in which its traces are the most conspicuous. To what purpose, then, do the expedients in the construction of animals and vegetables which excite the admiration of naturalists appear to tend? There is no blinking the fact that they tend principally to no more exalted object than to make the structure remain in life and in working order for a certain time. The individual for a few years, the species or race for a longer but still a limited period, and the similar though less conspicuous marks of creation which are recognized in inorganic nature are generally of the same character. The adaptations, for instance, which appear in the solar system consist in placing it under conditions which enable the mutual action of its parts to maintain, instead of destroying, its stability, and even that only for a time, vast indeed if measured against our short span of animated existence, but which can be perceived even by us to be limited. For even the feeble means which we possess of exploring the past are believed by those who have examined the subject by the most recent lights to yield evidence that the solar system was once a vast sphere of nebula or vapour, and is going through a process which in the course of ages will reduce it to a single and not very large mass of solid matter frozen up with more than the Arctic cold. If the machinery of the system is adapted to keep itself at work only for a time, still less perfect is the adaptation of it for the abode of living beings, since it is only adapted to them during the relatively short portion of its total duration which intervenes between the time when each planet was too hot and the time when it became, or will become, too cold to admit of life under the only conditions in which we have experience of its possibility. Or we should perhaps reverse the statement and say that organization and life are only adapted to the conditions of the solar system during a relatively short portion of the system's existence. The greater part, therefore, of the design of which there is indication in nature, however wonderful its mechanism, is no evidence of any moral attributes, because the end to which it is directed, and its adaptation to which end is the evidence of it being directed to an end at all, is not a moral end. It is not the good of any sentient creature, it is but the qualified permanence, for a limited period, of the work itself, whether animate or inanimate. The only inference that can be drawn from most of it, respecting the character of the Creator, is that he does not wish his work to perish as soon as created. He wills them to have a certain duration. From this alone nothing can be justly inferred as to the manner in which he is affected towards his animate or rational creatures. After deduction of the great number of adaptations which have no apparent object but to keep the machine going, there remain a certain number of provisions for giving pleasure to living beings, and a certain number of provisions for giving them pain. There is no positive certainty that the whole of these ought not to take their place among the contrivances for keeping the creature or its species in existence. For both the pleasures and the pains have a conservative tendency, the pleasures being generally so disposed as to attract to the things which maintain individual or collective existence, the pains so as to deter from such as would destroy it. When all these things are considered, it is evident that a vast deduction must be made from the evidences of a Creator before they can be counted as evidences of a benevolent purpose. So vast, indeed, that some may doubt whether after such a deduction there remains any balance. Yet, endeavouring to look at the question without partiality or prejudice, and without allowing wishes to have any influence over a judgment, it does appear that, granting the existence of design, there is a preponderance of evidence that the Creator desired the pleasure of his creatures. This is indicated by the fact that pleasure of one description or another is afforded by almost everything. The mere play of the faculties, physical and mental, being a never-ending source of pleasure. And even painful things give pleasure, by the satisfaction of curiosity, and the agreeable sense of acquiring knowledge, and also that pleasure, when experienced, seems to result from the normal working of the machinery, while pain usually arises from some external interference with it, and resembles in each particular case the result of an accident. Even in cases when pain results like pleasure from the machinery itself, the appearances do not indicate that contrivance was brought into play purposely to produce pain. What is indicated is rather a clumsiness in the contrivance employed for some other purpose. The author of the machinery is no doubt accountable for having made it susceptible of pain, but this may have been a necessary condition of its susceptibility to pleasure, a supposition which avails nothing on the theory of the omnipotent creature, but is an extremely probable one in the case of a contriver working under the limitations of inexorable laws and indestructible properties of matter. The susceptibility being conceded as a thing which did enter into design, the pain itself usually seems like a thing undesigned, a casual result of the collision of the organism with some outward force to which it was not intended to be exposed, and which, in many cases, provision is even made to hinder it from being exposed to. There is, therefore, much appearance that pleasure is agreeable to the Creator, while there is very little, if any, appearance that pain is so. And there is a certain amount of justification for inferring, on grounds of natural theology alone, that benevolence is one of the attributes of the Creator. But to jump from this to the inference that his sole or chief purposes are those of benevolence, and that the single end and aim of creation was the happiness of his creatures, it is not only not justified by any evidence, but it is a conclusion in opposition to such evidence as we have. If the motive of the Deity for creating sentient beings was the happiness of the beings he created, his purpose, in our corner of the universe at least, must be pronounced, taking past ages and all countries and races into account, to have been thus far an ignominious failure. And if God had no purpose but our happiness and that of other living creatures, it is not credible that he would have called them into existence with the prospect of being so completely baffled. If man had not the power by the exercise of his own energies for the improvement of both himself and his outward circumstances, to do for himself and other creatures vastly more than God had, in the first instance, done, the being who called him into existence would deserve something very different from thanks at his hands. Of course it may be said that this very capacity of improving himself and the world was given to him by God, and that the change which he will be thereby enabled ultimately to effect in human existence will be worth purchasing by the suffering and wasted lives of an entire geological period. This may be so, but to suppose that God could not have given him these blessings at a less frightful cost is to make a very strange supposition concerning the Deity. It is to suppose that God could not, in the first instance, create anything better than a Bosjesman, or an Andaman Islander, or something still lower, and yet was able to endow the Bosjesman or the Andaman Islander with the power of raising himself into a Newton or a Fenelon. We certainly do not know the nature of the barriers which limit the divine omnipotence, but it is a very odd notion of them that they enable the Deity to confer on an almost bestial creature the power of producing by a succession of efforts what God himself had no other means of creating. Such are the indications of natural religion in respect to the divine benevolence. If we look for any other of the moral attributes which a certain class of philosophers are accustomed to distinguish from benevolence, as for example justice, we find a total blank. There is no evidence whatever in nature for divine justice, whatever standard of justice our ethical opinions may lead us to recognize. There is no shadow of justice in the general arrangement of nature, and what imperfect realization it obtains in any human society, a most imperfect realization as yet, is the work of man himself, struggling upwards against immense natural difficulties into civilization, and making to himself a second nature far better and more unselfish than he was created with. But on this point enough has been said in another essay, also referred to on nature. These, then, are the net results of natural theology on the question of the divine attributes. A being of great but limited power, how or by what limited we cannot even conjecture, of great and perhaps unlimited intelligence, but perhaps also more narrowly limited than his power, who desires and pays some regard to the happiness of his creatures, but who seems to have other motives of action which he cares more for, and who can hardly be supposed to have created the universe for that purpose alone. Such is the Deity whom natural religion points to, and any idea of God more captivating than this comes only from human wishes, or from the teaching of either real or imaginary revelation. We shall next examine whether the light of nature gives any indications concerning the immortality of the soul, and a future life. End of Theism, Section 5. Recording by Sunny Shields. Doha, State of Qatar, June 2011. Section 14 of 3 Essays on Religion. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. 3 Essays on Religion by John Stuart Mill. Theism, Section 6. Part 3. Immortality. The indications of immortality may be considered in 2 divisions: those which are independent of any theory respecting the Creator and his intentions, and those which depend upon an antecedent belief on that subject. Of the former class of arguments, speculative men have in different ages put forward a considerable variety, of which those in the Phaedon of Plato are an example. But they are for the most part such as have no adherents, and need not be seriously refuted now. They are generally founded upon preconceived theories as to the nature of the thinking principle in man, considered as distinct and separable from the body, and on other preconceived theories respecting death. As, for example, that death or dissolution is always a separation of parts, and the soul being without parts, being simple and indivisible, is not susceptible of this separation. Curiously enough, one of the interlocutors in the Phaedon anticipates the answer by which an objector of the present day would meet this argument, namely, that thought and consciousness, though mentally distinguishable from the body, may not be a substance separable from it, but a result of it, standing in relation to it. The illustration is Plato's, like that of a tune to the musical instrument on which it is played, and that the arguments used to prove that the soul does not die with the body would equally prove that the tune does not die with the instrument, but survives its destruction and continues to exist apart. In fact, those moderns who dispute the evidences of the immortality of the soul do not, in general, believe the soul to be a substance per se, but regard it as the name of a bundle of attributes, the attributes of feeling, thinking, reasoning, believing, willing, etc. And these attributes they regard as a consequence of the bodily organization, which therefore, they argue, it is as unreasonable to suppose surviving when that organization is dispersed, as to suppose the colour or odour of a rose surviving when the rose itself has perished. Those, therefore, who would deduce the immortality of the soul from its own nature, have first to prove that the attributes in question are not attributes of the body, but of a separate substance. Now what is the verdict of science on this point? It is not perfectly conclusive either way. In the first place, it does not prove experimentally that any mode of organization has the power of producing feeling or thought. To make that proof good, it would be necessary that we should be able to produce an organism and try whether it would feel, which we cannot do. Organisms cannot by any human means be produced. They can only be developed out of a previous organism. On the other hand, the evidence is well nigh complete that all thought and feeling has some action of the bodily organism for its immediate antecedent or accompaniment, that the specific variations and especially the different degrees of complication of the nervous and cerebral organization correspond to differences in the development of the mental faculties, and though we have no evidence except negative that the mental consciousness ceases forever when the functions of the brain are at an end, we do know that disease of the brain disturbs the mental functions, and that decay or weakness of the brain enfeebles them. We have therefore sufficient evidence that cerebral action is, if not the cause, at least in our present state of existence, a condition sine qua non of mental operation, and that assuming the mind to be a distinct substance, its separation from the body would not be, as some have vainly flattered themselves, a liberation from trammels and restoration to freedom, but would simply put a stop to its functions, and remand it to unconsciousness, unless and until some other set of conditions supervenes capable of recalling it into activity, but of the existence of which experience does not give us the smallest indication. At the same time, it is of importance to remark that these considerations only amount to defect of evidence. They afford no positive argument against immortality. We must beware of giving a priori validity to the conclusions of an a posteriori philosophy. The root of all a priori thinking is that tendency to transfer to outward things a strong association between the corresponding ideas in our own minds, and the thinkers who most sincerely attempt to limit their beliefs by experience, and honestly believe that they do so, are not always sufficiently on their guard against this mistake. There are thinkers who regard it as truth of reason that miracles are impossible, and in like manner there are others who believe the phenomenon of life and consciousness are associated in their minds by undeviating experience with the action of material organs, think it an absurdity per se to imagine it possible that those phenomena can exist under any other conditions. But they should remember that the uniform coexistence of one fact with another does not make the one fact a part of the other, or the same with it. The relation of thought to a material brain is no metaphysical necessity, but simply a constant coexistence within the limits of observation, and when analyzed to the bottom on the principles of the associative psychology, the brain, just as much as the mental functions, is, like matter itself, merely a set of human sensations, either actual or inferred as possible. Namely, those which the anatomist has when he opens the skull, and the impressions which we suppose we should receive of molecular or some other movements when the cerebral activity was going on, if there were no bony envelope, and our senses or our instruments were sufficiently delicate. Experience furnishes us with no example of any series of states of consciousness without this group of contingent sensations attached to it, but it is as easy to imagine such a series of states without as with this accompaniment, and we know of no reason in the nature of things against the possibility of its being thus disjoined. We may suppose that the same thoughts, emotions, volitions, and even sensations which we have here may persist or recommence somewhere else under other conditions, just as we may suppose that other thoughts and sensations may exist under other conditions in other parts of the universe. And in entertaining this supposition, we need not be embarrassed by any metaphysical difficulties about a thinking substance. Substance is but a general name for the perdurability of attributes. Wherever there is a series of thoughts connected together by memories, that constitutes a thinking substance. This absolute distinction in thought and separability in representation of our states of consciousness from the set of conditions with which they are united only by constancy of concomitance, is equivalent in a practical point of view to the old distinction of the two substances, matter and mind. There is, therefore, in science, no evidence against the immortality of the soul, but that negative evidence which consists in the absence of evidence in its favour. and even the negative evidence is not so strong as negative evidence often is. In the case of witchcraft, for instance, the fact that there is no proof which will stand examination of its having ever existed is as conclusive as the most positive evidence of its non-existence would be. For it exists, if it does exist, on this earth, where if it had existed, the evidence of fact would certainly have been available to prove it. But it is not so as to the soul's existence after death. That it does not remain on earth and go about visibly or interfere in the events of life is proved by the same weight of evidence which disproves witchcraft. But that it does not exist elsewhere, there is absolutely no proof. A very faint, if any, presumption is all that is afforded by its disappearance from the surface of this planet. Some may think that there is an additional and very strong presumption against the immortality of the thinking and conscious principle from the analysis of all the other objects of nature. All things in nature perish. The most beautiful and perfect being, as philosophers and poets alike complain, the most perishable. A flower of the most exquisite form and colouring grows up from a root, comes to perfection in weeks or months, and lasts only a few hours or days. Why should it be otherwise with man? Why indeed? But why also should it not be otherwise? Feeling and thought are not merely different from what we call inanimate matter, but are the opposite pole of existence, and analogical inference has little or no validity from the one to the other. Feeling and thought are much more real than anything else. They are the only things which we directly know to be real, all things else being merely the unknown conditions on which these in our present state of existence, or in some other, depend. All matter, apart from the feelings of sentient beings, has but an hypothetical and unsubstantial existence. It is a mere assumption to account for our sensations. Itself we do not perceive, we are not conscious of it, but only the sensations which we are said to receive from it. In reality, it is a mere name for our expectation of sensations, or for our belief that we can have certain sensations when certain other sensations give indications of them. Because these contingent possibilities of sensation sooner or later come to an end and give place to others, is it implied in this that the series of our feelings must itself be broken off? This would not be to reason from one kind of substantive reality to another, but to draw from something which has no reality except in reference to something else, conclusions applicable to that which is only substantive reality. Mind, or whatever name we give to what is implied in consciousness of a continued series of feelings, is in a philosophical point of view the only reality of which we have any evidence, and no analogy can be recognized or comparison made between it and other realities, because there are no other known realities to compare it with. That is quite consistent with its being perishable. But the question whether it is so or not is res integra, untouched by any of the results of human knowledge and experience. The case is one of those very rare cases in which there is really a total absence of evidence on either side, and which the absence of evidence for the affirmative does not, as in so many cases it does, create a strong presumption in favour of the negative. The belief, however, in human immortality in the minds of mankind generally is probably not grounded on any scientific arguments, either physical or metaphysical, but on foundations with most minds much stronger, namely, on one hand, the disagreeableness of giving up existence, to those at least to whom it has hitherto been pleasant, and on the other, the general traditions of mankind. The natural tendency of belief to follow these two inducements, our own wishes and the general assent of other people, has been in this instance reinforced by the utmost exertion of the power of public and private teaching. Rulers and instructors have at all times, with the view of getting greater effect to their mandates, whether from selfish or from public motives, encouraged to the utmost of their power the belief that there is a life after death, in which pleasures and sufferings far greater than on earth depend on our doing or leaving undone while alive what we are commanded to do in the name of the unseen powers. As causes of belief these various circumstances are most powerful. As rational grounds of it they carry no weight at all. That what is called the consoling nature of an opinion that is, the pleasure we should have in believing it to be true, can be a ground for believing it, is a doctrine irrational in itself, and which would sanction half the mischievous illusions recorded in history, or which mislead individual life. It is sometimes, in the case now under consideration, wrapped up in a quasi-scientific language. We are told that the desire of immortality is one of our instincts, and that there is no instinct which has not corresponding to it a real object fitted to satisfy it. Where there is hunger, there is somewhere food. Where there is sexual feeling, there is somewhere sex. Where there is love, there is somewhere something to be loved, and so forth. In like manner, since there is the instinctive desire of eternal life therefore must be. The answer to this is patent on the very surface of the subject. It is unnecessary to go into any recondite considerations concerning instincts, or to discuss whether the desire in question is an instinct or not. Granting that wherever there is an instinct there exists something such as that instinct demands, can it be affirmed that this something exists in boundless quantity, or sufficient to satisfy the infinite craving of human desires? What is called the desire of eternal life is simply the desire of life. And does there not exist that which this desire calls for? Is there not life? And is not the instinct, if it be an instinct, gratified by the possession and preservation of life? To suppose that the desire of life guarantees to us personally the reality of life through all eternity is like supposing that the desire of food assumes that we shall always have as much as we can eat through our whole lives, and as much longer as we can conceive our lives to be protracted to. The argument from tradition, or the general belief of the human race, if we accept it as a guide to our own belief, must be accepted entire. If so, we are bound to believe that the souls of human beings not only survive after death, but show themselves as ghosts to the living. For we find no people who have had the one belief without the other. Indeed, it is probable that the former belief originated in the latter, and that primitive men would never have supposed that the soul did not die with the body if they had not fancied that it visited them after death. Nothing could be more natural than such a fancy. It is, in appearance, completely realized in dreams, which in Homer, and in all ages like Homer's, are supposed to be real apparitions. To dreams we have to add not merely waking hallucinations, but the delusions, however baseless, of sight and hearing, or rather the misinterpretations of those senses, sight or hearing supplying mere hints from which imagination paints a complete picture, and invests it with reality. These delusions are not to be judged of by a modern standard. In early times the line between imagination and perception was by no means clearly defined. There was little or none of the knowledge we now possess of the actual course of nature, which makes us distrust or disbelieve any appearance which is at variance with known laws. In the ignorance of men as to what were the limits of nature, and what was or was not compatible with it, no one thing seemed, as far as physical considerations went, to be much more improbable than another. In rejecting, therefore, as we do, and as we have the best reason to do, the tales and legends of the actual appearances of disembodied spirits, we take from under the general belief of mankind in a life after death what in all probability was its chief ground and support, and deprive it of even the very little value which the opinion of rude ages can ever have as evidence of truth. If it be said that this belief has maintained itself in ages which have ceased to be rude, and which reject the superstitions with which it once was accompanied, the same may be said of many other opinions of rude ages, and especially on the most important and interesting subjects, because it is on those subjects that the reigning opinion, whatever it may be, is most sedulously inculcated upon all who are born into the world. This particular opinion, moreover, if it has on the whole kept its ground, has done so with a constantly increasing number of dissensions, and those equally among cultivated minds. Finally, those cultivated minds which adhere to the belief, ground it, we may reasonably suppose, not on the belief of others, but on arguments and evidences, and those arguments and evidences, therefore, are what it concerns us to estimate and judge. The preceding are a sufficient sample of the arguments for a future life, which do not suppose an antecedent belief in the existence, or any theory respecting the attributes of the Godhead. It remains to consider what arguments are supplied by such lights, or such grounds of conjecture, as natural theology affords on those great questions. We have seen that these lights are but faint, that of the existence of a Creator they afford no more than a preponderance of probability, of his benevolence a considerably less preponderance, that there is, however, some reason to think that he cares for the pleasure of his creatures, but by no means that this is his sole care, or that other purposes do not often take precedence of it. His intelligence must be adequate to the contrivances apparent in the universe, but need not be more than adequate to them. And his power is not only not proved to be infinite, but the only real evidences in natural theology tend to show that it is limited, contrivance being a mode of overcoming difficulties and always supposing difficulties to be overcome. We have now to consider what inference can legitimately be drawn from these premises in favour of a future life. It seems to me, apart from express revelation, none at all. The common arguments are the goodness of God, the improbability that he would ordain the annihilation of his noblest and richest work, after the greater part of its few years of life have been spent in the acquisition of faculties which time has not allowed him to turn to fruit, and the special improbability that he would have implanted in us an instinctive desire of eternal life, and doomed that desire to complete disappointment. These might be arguments in a world the constitution of which made it possible without contradiction to hold it for the work of a being at once omnipotent and benevolent. But they are not arguments in a world like that in which we live. The benevolence of the divine being may be perfect, but his power being subject to unknown limitations, we know not that he could have given us what we so confidently assert that he must have given, could, that is, without sacrificing something more important. Even his benevolence, however justly inferred, is by no means indicated as the interpretation of his whole purpose, and since we cannot tell how far other purposes may have interfered with the exercise of his benevolence, we know not if he would, even if he could, have granted us eternal life. With regard to the supposed improbability of his having given the wish without its gratification, the same answer may be made. The scheme which either limitation of power or conflict of purposes compelled him to adopt may have required that we should have the wish, although it was not destined to be gratified. One thing, however, is quite certain in respect to God's government of the world, that he either could not or would not grant to us everything we wish. We wish for life, and he granted some life. That we wish, or some of us wish, for a boundless extent of life, and that it is not granted, is no exception to the ordinary modes of his government. Many a man would like to be a Croesus or an Augustus Caesar, but has his wishes gratified only to the moderate extent of £1 a week, or the secretaryship of his trades union. There is, therefore, no assurance whatever of a life after death, on grounds of natural religion. But to any one who feels it conducive either to his satisfaction or to his usefulness to hope for a future state as a possibility, there is no hindrance to his indulging that hope. Appearances point to the existence of a being who has great power over us, all the power implied in the creation of the cosmos, or of its organized beings at least, and of whose goodness we have evidence, though not of its being his predominant attribute. And as we do not know the limit either of his power or of his goodness, there is room to hope that both the one and the other may extend to gratifying us this gift, provided that it would really be beneficial to us. The same ground which permits the hope warrants us in expecting that if there be a future life, it will be at least as good as the present, and will not be wanting in the best feature of the present life, improvability by our own efforts. Nothing can be more opposed to every estimate we can form of probability than the common idea of the future life as a state of rewards and punishments in any other sense than that the consequences of our actions upon our own character and susceptibilities will follow us in the future as they have done in the past and present. Whatever be the probabilities of a future life, all the probabilities in case of a future life are that such as we have been made or have made ourselves before the change, such we shall enter into the life hereafter, and that the fact of death will make no sudden break in our spiritual life, nor influence our character any otherwise than as an important change in our mode of existence may always be expected to modify it. Our thinking principle has its laws which in this life are invariable, and any analogies drawn from this life must assume that the same laws will continue. To imagine that a miracle will be wrought at death by the act of God making perfect every one whom it is his will to include among his elect, might be justified by an express revelation duly authenticated, but it is utterly opposed to every presumption that can be deduced from the light of nature. End of Theism, Section 6. Recording by Sunny Shields, Doha, State of Qatar, June 2011. Section 15 of 3 Essays on Religion. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. 3 Essays on Religion by John Stuart Mill. Theism, Section 7. Part 4. Revelation. The discussion in the preceding pages respecting the evidences of theism has been strictly confined to those which are derived from the light of nature. It is a different question what addition has been made to those evidences, and to what extent the conditions obtainable from them have been amplified or modified by the establishment of a direct communication with the Supreme Being. It would be beyond the purpose of this essay to take into consideration the positive evidences of the Christian or any other belief which claims to be a revelation from heaven. But such general considerations as are applicable not to a particular system but to revelation generally may properly find a place here, and are indeed necessary to give a sufficient practical bearing to the results of the preceding investigation. In the first place, then, the indications of a Creator and of his attributes, which we have been able to find in nature, though so much slighter and less conclusive even as to his existence than the pious mind would wish to consider them, and still more unsatisfactory in the information they afford as to his attributes, are yet sufficient to give the supposition of a revelation a standing point, which it would not otherwise have had. The alleged revelation is not obliged to build up its case from the foundation. It has not to prove the very existence of the being from whom it professes to come. It claims to be a message from a being whose existence, whose power, and to a certain extent whose wisdom and goodness are, if not proved, at least indicated, with more or less of probability, by the phenomena of nature. The sender of the alleged message is not a sheer invention. There are grounds, independent of the message itself, for belief in his reality. Grounds which, though insufficient for proof, are sufficient to take away all antecedent improbability from the supposition that a message may really have been received from him. It is, moreover, much to the purpose to take notice that the very imperfection of the evidences which natural theology can produce of the divine attributes removes some of the chief stumbling blocks to the belief of a revelation, since the objections grounded on imperfections in the revelation itself, however conclusive against it, if it is considered as a record of the acts or an expression of the wisdom of a being of infinite power, combined with infinite wisdom and goodness, are no reason whatever against it having come from a being such as the course of nature points to, whose wisdom is possibly, his power certainly, limited, and whose goodness, though real, is not likely to have been the only motive which actuated him in the work of creation. The argument of Butler's analogy is, from its own point of view, conclusive. The Christian religion is open to no objections, either moral or intellectual, which do not apply at least equally to the common theory of deism. The morality of the Gospels is far higher and better than that which shows itself in the order of nature. And what is morally objectionable in the Christian theory of the world is objectionable only when taken in conjunction with the doctrine of an omnipotent God, and, at least as understood by most enlightened Christians, by no means imports any moral obliquity in a being whose power is supposed to be restricted by real, though unknown, obstacles, which prevented him from fully carrying out his design. The grave error of Butler was that he shrank from admitting the hypothesis of limited powers, and his appeal consequently amounts to this: the belief of Christians is neither more absurd nor more immoral than the belief of deists who acknowledge an omnipotent Creator. Let us, therefore, in spite of the absurdity and immorality, believe both. He ought to have said, let us cut down our belief of either to what does not involve absurdity or immorality, to what is neither intellectually self-contradictory nor morally perverted. To return, however, to the main subject, on the hypothesis of a God who made the world and in making it had regard, however that regard may have been limited by other considerations, to the happiness of his sentient creatures, there is no antecedent improbability in the supposition that his concern for their good would continue, and that he might once, or oftener, give proof of it by communicating to them some knowledge of himself beyond what they were able to make out by their unassisted faculties, and some knowledge or precepts useful for guiding them through the difficulties of life. Neither on the only tenable hypothesis, that of limited power, is it open to us to object that these helps ought to have been greater, or in any way other than they are. The only question to be entertained, and which we cannot dispense ourselves from entertaining, is that of evidence. Can any evidence suffice to prove a divine revelation? And of what nature and what amount must that evidence be? Whether the special evidences of Christianity, or of any other alleged revelation, do or do not come up to the mark, is a different question, into which I do not propose directly to enter. The question I intend to consider is, what evidence is required, what general conditions it ought to satisfy, and whether they are such as, according to known constitution of things, can be satisfied. The evidences of revelation are commonly distinguished as external or internal. External evidences are the testimony of the senses or of witnesses. By the internal evidences are meant the indications which the revelation itself is thought to furnish of its divine origin, indications supposed to consist chiefly in the excellence of its precept and its general suitability to the circumstances and needs of human nature. The consideration of these internal evidences is very important, but their importance is principally negative. They may be conclusive grounds for rejecting a revelation, but cannot of themselves warrant the acceptance of it as divine. If the moral character of the doctrine of an alleged revelation is bad and perverting, we ought to reject it from whomsoever it comes, for it cannot come from a good and wise being. But the excellence of their morality can never entitle us to ascribe them to a supernatural origin, for we cannot have conclusive reason for believing that the human faculties were incompetent to find out moral doctrines, of which the human faculties can perceive and recognize the excellence. A revelation, therefore, cannot be proved divine unless by external evidence, that is, by the exhibition of supernatural facts, and we have to consider whether it is possible to prove supernatural facts, and if it is, what evidence is required to prove them. This question has only, so far as I know, been seriously raised on the sceptical side by Hume. It is the question involved in his famous argument against miracles, an argument which goes down to the depths of the subject, but the exact scope and effect of which, perhaps not conceived with perfect correctness by that great thinker himself, have in general been utterly misconceived by those who have attempted to answer him. Dr. Campbell, for example, one of the acutest of his antagonists, has thought himself obliged, in order to support the credibility of miracles, to lay down doctrines which virtually go the length of maintaining that antecedent improbability is never a sufficient ground for refusing credence to a statement, if it is well attested. Dr. Campbell's fallacy lay in overlooking a double meaning of the word improbability, as I have pointed out in my Logic, and still earlier in an editorial note to Bentham's Treatise on Evidence. Taking the question from the very beginning, it is evidently impossible to maintain that if a supernatural fact really occurs, proof of its occurrence cannot be accessible to the human faculties. The evidence of our senses could prove this, as it can prove other things. To put the most extreme case, suppose that I actually saw and heard a being, either of the human form or of some form previously unknown to me, commanding a world to exist, and a new world actually starting into existence and commencing a movement through space at his command. There can be no doubt that this evidence would convert the creation of worlds from a speculation into a fact of experience. It may be said, I could not know that so singular an appearance was anything more than a hallucination of my senses. True, but the same doubt exists at first respecting every unsuspected and surprising fact which comes to light in our physical researches. That our senses have been deceived is a possibility which has to be met and dealt with, and we do deal with it by several means. If we repeat the experiment, and again with the same result, If at the time of the observation the impressions of our senses are in all other respects the same as usual, rendering the supposition of their being morbidly affected in this one particular extremely improbable, above all, if other people's senses confirm the testimony of our own, we conclude, with reason, that we may trust our senses. Indeed, our senses are all that we have to trust to. We depend on them for the ultimate premise even of our reasoning. There is no other appeal against their decision than an appeal from the senses without precautions to the senses with all due precautions. When the evidence on which an opinion rests is equal to that upon which the whole conduct and safety of our lives is founded, we need ask no further. Objections which apply equally to all evidence are valid against none. They only prove abstract fallibility. But the evidence of miracles, at least to Protestant Christians, is not, in our own day, of this cogent description. It is not the evidence of our senses, but of witnesses, and even this not at first hand, but resting on the attestation of books and traditions. And even in the case of the original eyewitnesses, the supernatural facts asserted on their alleged testimony are not of the transcendent character supposed in our example, about the nature of which, or the impossibility of their having had a natural origin, there could be little room for doubt. On the contrary, the recorded miracles are, in the first place, generally such as would have been extremely difficult to verify as matters of fact, and in the next place are hardly ever beyond the possibility of having been brought about by human means or by the spontaneous agencies of nature. It is to cases of this kind that Hume's argument against the credibility of miracles was meant to apply. His argument is, the evidence of miracles consists of testimony. The grounds of our reliance on testimony is our experience that certain conditions being supposed, testimony is generally veracious. But the same experience tells us that even under the best conditions, testimony is frequently, either intentionally or unintentionally, false. When, therefore, the fact to which testimony is produced is one the happening of which would be more at variance with experience than the falsehood of testimony, we ought not to believe it. And this rule all prudent persons observe in the conduct of life. Those who do not are sure to suffer for their credulity. Now a miracle, the argument goes on to say, is, in the highest possible degree, contradictory to experience. For, if it were not contradictory to experience, it would not be a miracle. The very reason for it being regarded as a miracle is that it is a breach of a law of nature, that is, of an otherwise invariable and inviolable uniformity in the succession of natural events. There is, therefore, the very strongest reason for disbelieving it, that experience can give for disbelieving anything. But the mendacity or error of witnesses, even though numerous and of fair character, is quite within the bounds of even common experience. That supposition, therefore, ought to be preferred. There are two apparently weak points in this argument. One is, that the evidence of experience to which an appeal is made is only negative evidence, which is not so conclusive as positive, since facts of which there had been no previous experience are often discovered, and proved by positive experience to be true. The other seemingly vulnerable point is this. The argument has the appearance of assuming that the testimony of experience against miracles is undeviating and indubitable, as it would be if the whole question was about the probability of future miracles, none having taken place in the past. Whereas, the very thing asserted on the other side is that there have been miracles, and that the testimony of experience is not wholly on the negative side. All the evidence alleged in favour of any miracle ought to be reckoned as counter-evidence in refutation of the ground on which it is asserted that miracles ought to be disbelieved. The question can only be stated fairly as depending on a balance of evidence, a certain amount of positive evidence in favour of miracles, and a negative presumption for the general course of human experience against them. In order to support the argument under this double correction, it has to be shown that the negative presumption against a miracle is very much stronger than that against a merely new and surprising fact. This, however, is evidently not the case. A new physical discovery, even if it consists in the defeating of a well-established law of nature, is but the discovery of another law previously unknown. There is nothing in this but what is familiar to our experience. We were aware that we did not know all the laws of nature, and we were aware that one such law is liable to be counteracted by others. The new phenomenon when brought to light, is found still to depend on law. It is always exactly reproduced when the same circumstances are repeated. Its occurrence, therefore, is within the limits of variation in experience, which experience itself discloses. But a miracle, in the very fact of being a miracle, declares itself to be a supersession, not of one natural law by another, but of the law which includes all others, which experience shows to be universal for all phenomena, viz., that they depend on some law, that they are always the same when there are the same phenomenal antecedents, and neither take place in the absence of their phenomenal causes, nor ever fail to take place when the phenomenal conditions are all present. It is evident that this argument against belief in miracles had very little to rest upon until a comparatively modern stage in the progress of science. A few generations ago, the universal dependence of phenomena on invisible laws was not only not recognized by mankind in general, but could not be regarded by the instructed as a scientifically established truth. There were many phenomena which seemed quite irregular in their course, without dependence on any known antecedents, and though, no doubt, a certain regularity in the occurrence of the most familiar phenomena must always have been recognized, yet even in these, the exceptions which were constantly occurring had not, by an investigation and generalization of the circumstances of their occurrence, been reconciled with the general rule. The heavenly bodies were from of old the most conspicuous type of regular and unvarying order. Yet even among them comets were a phenomenon apparently originating without any law, and eclipses one which seemed to take place in violation of law. Accordingly, both comets and eclipses long continued to be regarded as of miraculous nature, intended as signs and omens of human fortunes. It would have been impossible in those days to prove to anyone that this supposition was antecedently improbable. It seemed more comfortable to appearances than the hypothesis of an unknown law. Now, however, when in the progress of science all phenomena have been shown by indisputable evidence to be amenable to law, and even in the cases in which those laws have not yet been exactly ascertained, delay in ascertaining them is fully accounted for by the special difficulties of the subject, the defenders of miracles have adapted their argument to this altered state of things, by maintaining that a miracle need not necessarily be a violation of law. It may, they say, take place in fulfilment of a more recondite law to us unknown. If by this it is only meant that the divine being, in the exercise of his power of interfering with and suspending his own laws, guides himself by some general principle or rule of action, this, of course, cannot be disproved, and is in itself the most probable supposition. But if the argument means that a miracle may be the fulfilment of a law in the same sense in which the ordinary events of nature are fulfilment of laws, it seems to indicate an imperfect conception of what is meant by a law and of what constitutes a miracle. When we say that an ordinary physical fact always takes place according to some invariable law, we mean that it is connected by uniform sequence or coexistence with some definite set of physical antecedents, that whenever that set is exactly reproduced, the same phenomenon will take place, unless counteracted by the similar laws of some other physical antecedents, and that whenever it does take place, it would always be found that its special set of antecedents, or one of its sets if it has more than one, has pre-existed. Now, an event which takes place in this manner is not a miracle. To make it a miracle, it must be produced by a direct violation, without the use of means, or at least of any means which if simply repeated would produce it. To constitute a miracle, a phenomenon must take place without having been preceded by any antecedent phenomenal conditions sufficient again to reproduce it, or a phenomenon for the production of which the antecedent conditions existed must be arrested or prevented without the intervention of any phenomenal antecedents which would arrest or prevent it in a future case. The test of a miracle is, was there present in the case such external conditions, such second causes we may call them, that whenever these conditions or causes reappear, the event will be reproduced. If there were, it is not a miracle. If there were not, it is a miracle, but it is not according to law. It is an event produced without or in spite of law. It will perhaps be said that a miracle does not necessarily exclude the intervention of second causes. If it were the will of God to raise a thunderstorm by miracle, he might do it by means of wind and clouds, undoubtedly, but the wind and clouds were either sufficient when produced to excite the thunderstorm without other divine assistance, or they were not. If they were not, the storm is not a fulfillment of law, but a violation of it. If they were sufficient, there is a miracle, but it is not the storm, it is the production of the winds and the clouds, or whatever link in the chain of causation it was at which the influence of physical antecedents was dispensed with. If that influence was never dispensed with, but the event called miraculous was produced by natural means, and those again by others, and so on from the beginning of things, if the event is no otherwise the act of God than in having been foreseen and ordained by him as the consequence of the forces put in action at the creation, then there is no miracle at all, nor anything different from the ordinary working of God's providence. For another example, a person professing to be divinely commissioned cures a sick person by some apparently insignificant external application. Would this application, administered by a person not specially commissioned from above, have effected the cure? If so, there is no miracle. If not, there is a miracle, but there is a violation of law. End of Theism, Section 7. Recording by Sunny Shield, Doha, State of Qatar, June 2011. Section 16 of 3 Essays on Religion. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. 3 Essays on Religion by John Stuart Mill. Theism, Section 8. It will be said, however, that if these be violations of law, then law is violated every time that an outward effect is produced by a voluntary act of a human being. Human volition is constantly modifying natural phenomena, not by violating their laws, but by using their laws. Why may not divine volition do the same? The power of volition over phenomena is itself a law, and one of the earliest known and acknowledged laws of nature. It is true that human will exercises power over objects in general indirectly through the direct power which it possesses only over the human muscles. God, however, has direct power not merely over one thing, but over all the objects which he has made. There is, therefore, no more a supposition of violation of law in supposing that events are produced, prevented, or modified by God's action, than in the supposition of their being produced, prevented, or modified by man's action. Both are equally in the course of nature, both equally consistent with what we know of the government of all things by law. Those who thus argue are mostly believers in free will, and maintain that every human volition originates a new chain of causation, of which it is itself the commencing link, not connected by invariable sequence with any anterior fact. Even therefore, if a design interposition did constitute a breaking in upon the connected chain of events by the introduction of a new originating cause without root in the past, this would be no reason for discrediting it, since every human act of volition does precisely the same. If the one is a breach of law, so are the others. In fact, the reign of law does not extend to the origination of volition. Those who dispute the free will theory, and regard volition as no exception to the universal law of cause and effect, may answer that volitions do not interrupt the chain of causation, but carry it on, the connection of cause and effect being of just the same nature between motive and act as between a combination of physical antecedents and physical consequent. But this, whether true or not, does not really affect the argument, for the interference of human will with the course of nature is only not an exception to law when we include among laws the relation of motive to volition, and by the same rule interference by the divine will would not be an exception either, since we cannot but suppose the deity in every one of his acts to be determined by motives. The alleged analogy therefore holds good, but what it proves is only what I have from the first maintained, that divine intervention with nature could be proved if we had the same sort of evidence for it which we have for human interference. The question of antecedent improbability only arises because divine interposition is not certified by the direct evidence of perception, but is always matter of inference, and more or less of speculative inference, and a little consideration will show that in these circumstances the antecedent presumption against the truth of the inference is extremely strong. When the human will interferes to produce any physical phenomenon, except the movements of the human body, it does so by the employment of means, and is obliged to employ such means as are by their own physical properties sufficient to bring about the effect. Divine interference, by hypothesis, proceeds in a different manner from this. It produces its effect without means, or with such as are in themselves insufficient. In the first case, all the physical phenomena, except the first bodily movement, are produced in strict conformity to physical causation, while the first movement is treated by positive observation to the cause, the volition, which produced it. In the other case, the event is supposed not to have been produced at all through physical causation, while there is no direct evidence to connect it with any volition. The ground on which it is ascribed to a volition is only negative, because there is no other apparent way of accounting for its existence. But in this merely speculative explanation, there is always another hypothesis possible, viz., that the event may have been produced by physical causes in a manner not apparent. It may either be due to a law of physical nature not yet known, or to the unknown presence of the conditions necessary for producing it according to some known law. Supposing even that the event, supposed to be miraculous, does not reach us through the uncertain medium of human testimony, but rests on the direct evidence of our own senses. Even then, so long as there is no direct evidence of its production by a divine volition, like that we have from the production of bodily movements by human volitions, so long, therefore, as the miraculous character of the event is but an inference from the supposed inadequacy of the laws of physical nature to account for it, so long will the hypothesis of a natural origin from the phenomenon be entitled to preference over that of supernatural one. The commonest principle of sound judgment forbid us to suppose from any effects a cause of which we have absolutely no experience, unless all those of which we have experience are ascertained to be absent. Now there are few things of which we have more frequent experience than of physical facts which our knowledge does not enable us to account for, because they depend either on laws which observation, aided by science, has not yet brought to light, or on facts the presence of which in the particular case is unsuspected by us. Accordingly, when we hear of a prodigy, we always, in these modern times, believe that if it really occurred it was neither the work of God nor of a demon, but the consequence of some unknown natural law, or of some hidden fact. Nor is either of these suppositions precluded when, as in the case of a miracle, properly so called, the wonderful event seemed to depend upon the will of a human being. It is always possible that there may be at work some undetected law of nature, which the wonder worker may have acquired, consciously or unconsciously, the power of calling into action, or that the wonder may have been wrought, as in the truly extraordinary feats of jugglers, by the employment, unperceived by us, of ordinary laws, which also need not be a case of voluntary deception. Or lastly, the event may have had no connection with the volition at all, but the coincidence between them may be the effect of craft or accident, the miracle worker having seemed or affected to produce by his will that which was already about to take place, as if one were to command an eclipse of the sun at the moment that one knew by astronomy that an eclipse was on the point of taking place. In a case of this description the miracle might be tested by a challenge to repeat it, but it is worthy of remark that recorded miracles were seldom or never put to this test. No miracle worker seemed ever to have made a practice of raising the dead. That and the other most signal of the miraculous operations are reported to have been performed only in one or a few isolated cases, which may have been either cunningly selected cases or accidental coincidences. There is, in short, nothing to exclude the supposition that every alleged miracle was due to natural causes, and as long as that supposition remains possible, no scientific observer and no man of ordinary practical judgment would assume by conjecture a cause which no reason existed for supposing to be real, save the necessity of accounting for something which is sufficiently accounted for without it. Were we to stop here, the case against miracles might seem to be complete. But on further inspection it will be seen that we cannot, from the above considerations, conclude absolutely that the miraculous theory of the production of a phenomenon ought to be at once rejected. We can conclude only that no extraordinary powers which have ever been alleged to be exercised by any human being over nature can be evidence of miraculous gifts to any one to whom the existence of a supernatural being and his interference in human affairs is not already a vera causa. The existence of God cannot possibly be proved by miracles, for unless a God is already recognized, the apparent miracle can always be accounted for on a more probable hypothesis than that of the interference of a being, of whose very existence it is supposed to be the sole evidence. Thus far Hume's argument is conclusive. But it is far from being equally so when the existence of a being who created the present order of nature, and therefore may well be thought to have power to modify it, is accepted as a fact, or even as a probability resting on independent evidence. Once admit a God, and the production by his direct volition of an effect which in any case owed its origin to his creative will, is no longer a purely arbitrary hypothesis to account for the fact, but must be reckoned with as a serious possibility. The question then changes its character, and the decision of it must now rest upon what is known or reasonably surmised as to the manner of God's government of the universe. Whether this knowledge or surmise makes it the more probable supposition that the event was brought about by the agencies by which his government is ordinarily carried on, or that it is the result of a special and extraordinary interposition of his will in supersession of those ordinary agencies. In the first place, then, assuming as a fact the existence and providence of God, the whole of our observation of nature proves to us, by incontrovertible evidence, that the rule of his government is by means of second causes, that all facts, or at least all physical facts, follow uniformly upon given physical principles, and never occur but when the appropriate collection of physical conditions is realized. I limit the assertion to physical facts in order to leave the case of human volition an open question, though indeed I need not do so, for if the human will is free, it has been left free by the Creator, and is not controlled by him either through second causes or directly, so that, not being governed, it is not a specimen of his mode of government. Whatever he does govern, he governs by second causes. This was not obvious in the infancy of science. It was more and more recognized as the processes of nature were more carefully and accurately examined, until there now remains no class of phenomena of which it is not positively known, save some cases from their obscurity and complication our scientific processes have not yet been able completely to clear up and disentangle, and in which, therefore, the proof that they are governed by natural laws could not in the present state of science be more complete. The evidence, though merely negative, which these circumstances afford, that government by second causes is universal, is admitted for all except directly religious purposes to be conclusive. When either a man of science for scientific, or a man of the world for practical purposes inquires into an event, he asks himself what is its cause, and not has it any natural cause. A man would be laughed at who set down as one of the alternative suppositions that there is no other cause for it than the will of God. Against this weight of negative evidence we have to set such positive evidence as is produced in attestation of exceptions, in other words, the positive evidences of miracles. And I have already admitted that this evidence might conceivably have been such as to make the exception equally certain with the rule. If we had the direct testimony of our senses to a supernatural fact, it might be as completely authenticated and made certain as any natural one, but we never have. The supernatural character of the fact is always, as I have said, matter of inference and speculation, and the mystery always admits the possibility of a solution not supernatural. To those who already believe in supernatural power, the supernatural hypothesis may appear more probable than the natural one, but only if it accords with what we know or reasonably surmise respecting the way of the supernatural agent. Now all that we know from the evidence of nature concerning his ways is in harmony with the natural theory, and repugnant to the supernatural. There is, therefore, a vast preponderance of probability against a miracle, to counterbalance which would require a very extraordinary and indisputable congruity in the supposed miracle, and its circumstances with something which we conceive ourselves to know, or to have grounds for believing, with regards to the divine attributes. This extraordinary congruity is supposed to exist when the purpose of the miracle is extremely beneficial to mankind, as when it serves to accredit some highly important belief. The goodness of God, it is supposed, affords a high degree of antecedent probability that he would make an exception to his general rule of government for so excellent a purpose. For reasons, however, which have already been entered into, any inference drawn by us from the goodness of God to what he has or has not actually done is to the last degree precarious. If we reason directly from God's goodness to positive facts, no misery, no vice, nor crime ought to exist in the world. We can see no reason in God's goodness why, if he deviated once from the ordinary system of his government in order to do good to man, he should not have done so on 100 other occasions, nor why, if the benefit aimed at by some given deviation, such as the revelation of Christianity, was transcendent and unique, that precious gift should only have been vouchsafed after the lapse of many ages, or why, when it was at last given, the evidence of it should have been left open to so much doubt and difficulty. Let it be remembered also that the goodness of God affords no presumption in favour of a deviation from his general system of government, unless the good purpose could not have been attained without deviation. If God intended that mankind should receive Christianity, or any other gift, it would have agreed better with all that we know of his government to have made provisions in the scheme of creation for its arising at the appointed time by natural development, which, let it be added, all the knowledge we now possess concerning the history of the human mind tends to the conclusion that it actually did. To all these considerations ought to be added the extremely imperfect nature of the testimony itself, which we possess for the miracles, real or supposed, which accompanied the foundation of Christianity and of every other revealed religion. Taken at the best, it is the uncross-examined testimony of extremely ignorant people, credulous as such usually are, honourably credulous when the excellence of the doctrine or just reverence for the teacher makes them eager to believe, unaccustomed to draw the line between the perception of sense and what is superinduced upon them by the suggestions of a lively imagination, unversed in the difficult art of deciding between appearances and reality, and between the natural and the supernatural. In times, moreover, when no one thought it worth while to contradict any alleged miracle, because it was the belief of the age that miracles in themselves proved nothing, since they could be worked by a lying spirit as well as by the Spirit of God, such were the witnesses, and even of them we do not possess the direct testimony. The documents, of date long subsequent, even on the orthodox theory, which contains the only history of those events, very often do not even name the supposed eyewitnesses. They put down, it is but just to admit, the best and least absurd of the wonderful stories, such multitudes of which were current among the early Christians. But when they do, exceptionally, name any of the persons who were the subjects or spectators of the miracle, they doubtless draw from tradition and mention those names with which the story was in the popular mind, perhaps accidentally, connected. For whoever has observed the way in which even now a story grows up from some small foundation, taking on additional details at every step, knows well how from being at first anonymous it gets names attached to it, the name of someone by whom perhaps the story has been told being brought into the story itself, first as a witness and still later as a party concerned. It is also notable, and is a very important consideration, that stories of miracles only grow up among the ignorant, and are adopted, if ever, by the educated, when they have already become the belief of multitudes. Those which are believed by Protestants all originate in ages and nations in which there was hardly any canon of probability, and miracles were thought to be among the commonest of all phenomena. The Catholic Church, indeed, holds as an article of faith that miracles have never ceased, and new ones continue to be now and then brought forth and believed, even in the present incredulous age. Yet if in an incredulous generation, certainly not among the incredulous portion of it, but always among people who, in addition to the most childish ignorance, have grown up, as all do who are educated by the Catholic clergy, trained in the persuasion that it is the duty to believe and a sin to doubt, that it is dangerous to be sceptical about anything which is tended for belief in the name of the true religion, and that nothing is so contrary to piety as incredulity. For these miracles, which no one but a Roman Catholic, and by no means every Roman Catholic, believes, rest frequently upon an amount of testimony greatly surpassing that which we possess for any of the early miracles, and superior especially in one of the most essential points, that in many cases the alleged eyewitnesses are known, and we have their story at first hand. Thus, then, stands the balance of evidence in respect government of God, to be proved by other evidence. On the one side, the great negative presumption arising from the whole of what the course of nature discloses to us of the divine government, as carried on through second causes, and by invariable sequences of physical effects upon constant antecedents. On the other side, a few exceptional instances, attested by evidence not of a character to warrant belief in any facts in the smallest degree unusual or improbable, The eyewitnesses in most cases unknown, and none competent by character or education to scrutinize the real nature of the appearances which they may have seen, and moved moreover by a union of the strongest motives which can inspire human beings to persuade, first themselves and then others, that what they had seen was a miracle. Note: St. Paul, the only known exception to the ignorance and want of education of the first generation of Christians, attests no miracle, but that of his own conversion, which of all the miracles of the New Testament is the one which admits of the easiest explanation from natural causes. The facts, too, even if faithfully reported, are never incompatible with the supposition that they were either mere coincidences or were produced by natural means, even when no specific conjecture can be made as to those means, which in general it can. The conclusion I draw is that miracles have no claim whatever to the character of historical facts, and are wholly invalid as evidences of any revelation. What can be said with truth, and on the side of miracles, amounts only to this: considering that the order of nature affords some evidence of the reality of a Creator, and of his bearing good will to his creatures, though not of it being his sole prompter of his conduct towards them; considering again that all the evidence of his existence is evidence also that he is not all-powerful, and considering that in our ignorance of the limits of his power we cannot positively decide that he was able to provide for us by the original plan of creation all the good which it entered into his intentions to bestow upon us, or even to bestow any part of it at any earlier period than that at which we actually received it. Considering these things, when we consider further that a gift extremely precious came to us, which though facilitated was not apparently necessitated by what had gone before, but was due, as far as appearances go, to the peculiar mental and moral endowments of one man, and that man openly proclaimed that it did not come from himself but from God, through him, then we are entitled to say that there is nothing so inherently impossible or absolutely incredible in the supposition as to preclude any one from hoping that it may perhaps be true. I say from hoping. I go no further. For I cannot attach any evidentiary value to the testimony even of Christ on such a subject, since he is never said to have declared any evidence of his mission, unless his own interpretations of the prophecies be so considered, except internal conviction. And everybody knows that in pre-scientific times men always supposed that any unusual faculty which came to them, they knew not how, were an inspiration from God, the best men always being the readiest to ascribe any honourable peculiarity in themselves to that higher source, rather than their own merits. End of Theism, Section 8. Recording by Sonny Shields. Doha, State of Qatar, June 2011.
Section 17 of 3 Essays on Religion. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording by HearHis.com. 3 Essays on Religion by John Stuart Mill. Theism, Section 9. Part 5. General Result. From the result of the preceding examination of the evidences of theism, and theism being presupposed, of the evidences of any revelation, it follows that the rational attitude of a thinking mind towards the supernatural, whether in natural or in revealed religion, is that of skepticism, as distinguished from belief on the one hand, and from atheism on the other, including, in the present case, under atheism, the negative as well as the positive form of disbelief in a God. That is, not only the dogmatic denial of his existence, but the denial that there is any evidence on either side, which for most practical purposes amounts to the same thing as if the existence of a God had been disproved. If we are right in the conclusions to which we have been led by the preceding inquiry, there is evidence, but insufficient for proof, and amounting only to one of the lower degrees of probability. The indication given by such evidence, as there is, points to the creation, not indeed of the universe, but of the present order of it by an intelligent mind, whose power over the materials was not absolute, whose love for his creatures was not his sole actuating inducement, but who nevertheless desired their good. The notion of a providential government by an omnipotent being for the good of his creatures must be entirely dismissed. Even of the continued existence of the Creator, we have no other guarantee than that he cannot be subject to the law of death, which affects terrestrial beings, since the conditions that produce this liability, wherever it is known to exist, are of his creating. That this being, not being omnipotent, may have produced a machinery falling short of his intentions, and which may require the occasional interposition of the Maker's hand, is a supposition not in itself absurd nor impossible, though in none of the cases in which such interposition is believed to have occurred is the evidence such as could possibly prove it. It remains a simple possibility, which those may dwell on to whom it yields comfort to suppose that blessings which ordinary human power is inadequate to attain may come not from extraordinary human power, but from the bounty of an intelligence beyond the human, and which continuously cares for man. The possibility of a life after death rests on the same footing, of a boon which this powerful being, who wishes well to man, may have the power to grant, and which, if the message alleged to have been sent by him was really sent, he has actually promised. The whole domain of the supernatural is thus removed from the region of belief, and in that, for anything we can see, it is likely always to remain, for we can hardly anticipate either that any positive evidence will be acquired of the direct agency of divine benevolence in human destiny, or that any reason will be discovered for considering the realization of human hopes on that subject as beyond the pale of possibility. It is now to be considered whether the indulgence of hope in a region of imagination merely in which there is no prospect that any probable grounds of expectation will ever be obtained is irrational, and ought to be discouraged as a departure from the rational principle of regulating our feelings as well as opinions strictly by evidence. This is a point which different thinkers are likely, for a long time at least, to decide differently, according to their individual temperament. The principles which ought to govern the cultivation and the regulation of the imagination, which a view on the one hand of preventing it from disturbing the rectitude of the intelligent, and the right direction of the actions and will, and on the other hand of employing it as a power for increasing the happiness of life and giving elevation to the character, are a subject which has never yet engaged the serious consideration of philosophers, though some opinion on it is implied in almost all modes of thinking on human character and education. And I expect that this will hereafter be regarded as a very important branch of study for practical purposes, and the more in proportion as the weakening of positive beliefs respecting states of existence superior to the human leaves the imagination of higher things less provided with material from the domain of supposed reality. To me, it seems that human life, small and confined as it is, and as, considering merely in the present, it is likely to remain even when the progress of material and moral improvement may have freed it from the greater part of its present calamities, stands greatly in need of any wider range and greater height of aspiration for itself and its destination, which the exercise of imagination can yield to it without running counter to the evidence of fact, and that it is a part of wisdom to make the most of any, even small, probabilities on the subject, which furnish imagination with any footing to support itself upon. And I am satisfied that the cultivation of such a tendency in the imagination, provided it goes on pari passu with the cultivation of severe reason, has no necessary tendency to pervert the judgment, but that it is possible to form a perfectly sober estimate of the evidences on both sides of a question, and yet to let the imagination dwell by preference on those possibilities which are at once the most comforting and the most improving, without in the least degree overrating the solidarity of the grounds for expecting that these rather than any others will be the possibilities actually realized. Though this is not in the number of the practical maxims handed down by tradition and recognized as rules for the conduct of life, a great part of the happiness of life depends upon the tacit observance of it. What, for instance, is the meaning of that which is always accounted one of the chief blessings of life, a cheerful disposition? What but the tendency, either from constitution or habit, to dwell chiefly on the brighter side of the present and of the future? If every aspect, whether agreeable or odious, of everything ought to occupy exactly the same place in our imagination which it fills in fact, and therefore ought to fill in our deliberate reason, what we call a cheerful disposition would be but one of the forms of folly, on par except in agreeableness with the opposite disposition, in which the gloomy and painful view of all things is habitually predominant. But it is not found in practice that those who take life cheerfully are less alive to rational prospects of evil or danger, and more careless of making due provision against them than other people. The tendency is rather the other way, for a hopeful disposition gives a spur to the faculties and keeps all the active energies in good working order. When imagination and reason receive each of its appropriate culture, they do not succeed in usurping each other's prerogatives. It is not necessary, for keeping up our conviction that we must die, that we should be always brooding over death. It is far better that we should think no further about what we cannot possibly avert than is required for observing the rules of prudence in regard to our own life and that of others, and fulfilling whatever duties devolve upon us in contemplation of the inevitable event. The way to secure this is not to think perpetually of death, but to think perpetually of our duties and the rule of life. The true rule of practical wisdom is not that of making all the aspects of things equally predominant in our habitual contemplations, but of giving the greatest prominence to those of their aspects which depend on, or can be modified by, our own conduct. In things which do not depend on us, it is not solely for the sake of a more enjoyable life that the habit is desirable of looking at things and at mankind by preference on their pleasant side. It is also in order that we may be able to love them better and work with more heart for their improvement. To what purpose, indeed, should we feed our imagination with the unlovely aspect of persons and things? All unnecessary dwelling upon the evils of life is at best a useless expenditure of nervous force. And when I say unnecessary, I mean all that is not necessary either in the sense of being unavoidable, or in that of being needed for the permanence of our duties and for preventing our sense of the reality of those evils from becoming speculative and dim. But if it is often waste of strength to dwell on the evils of life, on its meannesses and basenesses, it is necessary to be aware of them, but to live in their contemplation makes it scarcely possible to keep up oneself a higher tone of mind. The imagination and feelings become tuned to a lower pitch. Degrading instead of elevating associations become connected with the daily objects and incidences of life, and give their color to the thoughts, just as associations of sensuality do to those who indulge freely in that sort of contemplations. Men often have felt what it is to have had their imaginations corrupted by one class of ideas, and I think they must have felt with the same kind of pain how the poetry is taken out of the things fullest of it, by mean associations, as when a beautiful air that had been associated with highly poetical words is heard sung with trivial and vulgar ones. All these things are said to be mere illustration of the principle that in the regulation of the imagination, literal truth of facts is not the only thing to be considered. Truth is the province of reason, and it is by the cultivation of the rational faculty that provision is made for its being known always, and thought of as often as is required by duty and the circumstances of human life. But when the reason is strongly cultivated, the imagination may safely follow its own end, and do its best to make life pleasant and lovely inside the castle, in reliance on the fortifications raised and maintained by reason round the outward bounds. On these principles, it appears to me that the indulgence of hope with regard to the government of the universe and the destiny of man after death, while we recognize as a clear truth that we have no ground for more than a hope, is legitimate and philosophically defensible. The beneficial effect of such a hope is far from trifling. It makes life and human nature a far greater thing to the feelings, and gives greater strength as well as greater solemnity to all the sentiments which are awakened in us by our fellow creatures and by mankind at large. It allays the sense that irony of nature, which is so painfully felt when we see the exertions and sacrifices of life culminating in the formation of a wise and noble mind, only to disappear from the world when the time has just arrived at which the world seems about to begin reaping the benefit of it. The truth that life is short and art is long is from of old one of the most discouraging parts of our condition. This hope admits the possibility that the art employed in improving and beautifying the soul itself may avail for good in some other life, even when seemingly useless for this. But the benefit consists less in the presence of any specific hope than in the enlargement of the general scale of the feelings, the loftier aspirations being no longer in the same degree checked and kept down by a sense of the insignificance of human life, by the disastrous feeling of not worth while. The gain obtained in the increased inducement to cultivate the improvement of character up to the end of life is obvious without being specified. There is another and a most important exercise of imagination which, in the past and present, has been kept up principally by means of religious belief, and which is infinitely precious to mankind, so much so that human excellence greatly depends upon the sufficiency of the provision made for it. This consists of the familiarity of the imagination with the conception of a morally perfect being, and the habit of taking the approbation of such a being as the norma or standard to which to refer and by which to regulate our own characters and lives. This idealization of our standard of excellence in a person is quite possible, even when that person is conceived as merely imaginary. But religion, since the birth of Christianity, has inculcated the belief that our highest conceptions of combined wisdom and goodness exist in the concrete of a living being who has his eyes on us and cares for our good. Though the darkest and most corrupt periods of Christianity has raised this torch on high, has kept this object of veneration and imitation before the eyes of man. True, the image of perfection has been most imperfect and, in many respects, a perverting and corrupting one, not only from the low moral ideas of the times, but from the mass of moral contradictions which the deluded worshipper was compelled to swallow by the supposed necessity for contemplating the good principle with the possession of infinite power. But it is one of the most universal as well as the most surprising characteristics of human nature, and one of the most speaking proofs of the low stage to which the reason of mankind at large has ever yet advanced, that they are capable of overlooking any amount of either moral or intellectual contradictions, and receiving into their minds propositions utterly inconsistent with one another, not only without being shocked by the contradiction, but without preventing both the contradictory beliefs from producing a part at least of their natural consequences of the mind. Pious men and women have gone on ascribing to God particular acts and a general course of will and conduct incompatible with even the most ordinary and limited conception of moral goodness, and have had their own ideas of morality, in many important particulars, totally warped and distorted, and notwithstanding this, have continued to conceive their God as clothed with all the attributes of the highest ideal goodness which their state of mind enabled them to conceive, and have had their aspirations toward goodness stimulated and encouraged by that conception. And it cannot be questioned that the undoubting belief of the real existence of a being who realizes our own best ideas of perfection, and of our being in the hands of that being as the ruler of the universe, gives an increase of force to these feelings beyond what they can receive from reference to a merely ideal conception. This particular advantage it is not possible for those to enjoy who take a rational view of the nature and amount of the evidence for the existence and attributes of the Creator. On the other hand, they are not encumbered with the moral contradictions which beset every form of religion which aims at justifying in a moral point of view the whole government of the world. They are, therefore, enabled to form a far truer and more consistent conception of ideal goodness than is possible to anyone who thinks it necessary to find ideal goodness in an omnipotent ruler of the world. The power of the Creator, once recognized as limited, there is nothing to disprove the supposition that his goodness is complete, and that the ideally perfect character in whose likeness we should wish to form ourselves, and to those supposed approbation we refer our actions, may have a real existence in a being to whom we owe all such good as we enjoy. Above all, the most valuable part of the effect on the character which Christianity has produced by holding up a divine person, a standard of excellence, and a model for imitation, is available even to the absolute unbeliever, and can never more be lost to humanity. For it is Christ, rather than God, whom Christianity has held up to believers as the pattern of perfection for humanity. It is the God incarnate, more than the God of the Jews or of nature, who, being idealized, has taken so great and salutary a hold on the modern mind. And whatever else may be taken away from us by rational criticism, Christ is still left, a unique figure, not more unlike all his precursors than all his followers, even those who had the direct benefit of his personal teaching. It is of no use to say that Christ, as exhibited in the Gospels, is not historical, and that we know not how much of what is admirable has been superadded by the tradition of his followers. The tradition of followers suffices to insert any number of marvels, and may have inserted all the miracles which he is reputed to have wrought. But who among his disciples, or among their proselytes, was capable of inventing the sayings ascribed to Jesus, or of imagining the life and character revealed in the Gospels? Certainly not the fishermen of Galilee, as certainly not St. Paul, whose character and idiosyncrasies were of a totally different sort, still less the early Christian writers, in whom nothing is more evident than that the good which was in them was all derived, as they always professed, that it was derived from the higher source. What could be added and interpolated by a disciple we may see in the mystical parts of the Gospel of St. John, matter imported from Philo and the Alexandrian Platonists, and put into the mouth of the Savior in long speeches about himself, such as the other Gospels contain not the slightest vestige of, though pretended to have been delivered on occasions of the deepest interest, and when his principal followers were all present, most prominently at the Last Supper. The East was full of men who could have stolen any quantity of this poor stuff, as the multitudinous Oriental sects of Gnostics afterwards did. But about the life and sayings of Jesus there is a stamp of personal originality combined with profundity of insight, which, if we abandon the idle expectation of finding scientific precision where something very different was aimed at, must place the prophet of Nazareth, even in the estimation of those who have no belief in his inspiration, in the very first rank of the men of sublime genius of whom our species can boast. When this preeminent genius is combined with the qualities of probably the greatest moral reformer and martyr to that mission who ever existed upon earth, religion cannot be said to have made a bad choice in pitching on this man as the ideal representative and guide of humanity. Nor, even now, would it be easy, even for an unbeliever, to find a better translation of the rule of virtue from the abstract into the concrete, than to endeavor so to live that Christ would approve our life. When to this we add that, to the conception of the rational skeptic, it remains a possibility that Christ actually was what he supposed himself to be, not God, for he never made the smallest pretension to that character, and would probably have thought such a pretension as blasphemous, as it seemed to the men who condemned him, but a man charged with a special, express, and unique commission from God, to lead mankind to truth and virtue. We may well conclude that the inferences of religion on the character which will remain after rational criticism has done its utmost against the evidences of religion are well worth preserving, and that what they lack in direct strength as compared with those of a firmer belief is more than compensated by the greater truth and rectitude of the morality they sanction. Impressions such as these, though not in themselves amounting to what can properly be called a religion, seem to me excellently fitted to aid and fortify that real, though purely human religion, which sometimes calls itself the religion of humanity, and sometimes that of duty. To the other inducements for cultivating a religious devotion to our welfare and our fellow creatures as an obligatory limit to every selfish aim, and an end for the direct promotion of which no sacrifice can be too great, it superadds the feeling that in making this the rule of our life, we may be cooperating with the unseen being to whom we owe all that is enjoyable in life. One elevated feeling this form of religious idea admits of, which is not open to those who believe in the omnipotence of the good principle in the universe, the feeling of helping God, of requiting the good he has given by a voluntary cooperation which he, not being omnipotent, really needs, and by which a somewhat nearer approach may be made to the fulfillment of his purposes. The conditions of human existence are highly favorable to the growth of such a feeling, inasmuch as a battle is constantly going on, in which the humblest human creature is not incapable of taking some part, between the powers of good and those of evil, and in which every, even the smallest, help to the right side has its value in promoting the very slow and often almost insensible progress by which good is gradually gaining ground from evil, yet gaining it so visibly at considerable intervals as to promise the very distant but not uncertain final victory of good. To do something during life, on even the humblest scale, if nothing more is within reach, towards bringing this consummation ever so little nearer, is the most animating and invigorating thought which can inspire a human creature, and that it is destined, with or without supernatural sanctions, to be the religion of the future, I cannot entertain a doubt. But it appears to me that supernatural hopes, and the degree and kind in which what I have called rational skepticism does not refuse to sanction them, may still contribute not a little to give to this religion its due ascendancy over the human mind.
End of Theism, Section 9. Recorded by hearhis.com. End of 3 Essays on Religion by John Stuart Mill.